Tonight on Dispatches, as the government prepares the first defence review in 12 years, we lift the lid on a culture of waste and extravagance at the MOD.
£2.4 million a year providing pop-star helicopters for the chiefs. There's a cost of this to the taxpayer which you just cannot justify.
We examine its top-heavy command structures.
How can we possibly have so many chiefs and so few Indians? That can't make sense.
And we expose its incestuous relationship with defence contractors.
The chairman and the chief executive of BAE can go into 10 Downing Street whenever they wish and see the Prime Minister, and that has always applied.
It's basically a protectionist racket. The price is paid by our armed forces. That's what makes this so outrageous.
In the next few weeks, the government will announce savage cuts at a time when frontline troops are already stretched. But will the government have the guts to force through the reforms that are really needed? On the 6th of September 2006, a patrol from the 3rd Battalion, the Parachute Regiment, strayed into a minefield in Helmand Province. A young corporal had his leg blown off. Medic, Lance Corporal Paul Hartley, rushed to help him.
Myself and a couple of assistants went in and we started to treat him. As we were treating him, we could see that there was mines basically laying on the ground. Mines laying on the hill would actually just run down.
Moments later, a second soldier was injured. Both men desperately needed to be evacuated. Back at base, their commanding officer, Colonel Stuart Tootle, knew there were no suitable British helicopters available. He turned to the Americans.
We asked for a Black Hawk helicopter because we knew that the Americans had them and they were equipped with winches. We were absolutely convinced it was what we needed, made some pretty forceful demands to get those helicopters, but to no avail.
With no Black Hawks available, Colonel Tootle was forced to make a fateful decision.
I had a soldier bleeding to death in the minefield. There was an option, they felt, to get a heavy Chinook helicopter to come in. And I felt we couldn't sit there and do nothing.
At first, when we heard the noise, we were quite relieved that the helicopters were coming. But then once we realised what sort of helicopter it was, obviously we got a bit concerned. A Chinook's a big old helicopter. It's got double rotors, it's got a massive down pressure when it takes off. After seeing how easy the mines were getting detonated in that minefield, we knew the Chinook were just going to cause more carnage.
Paul and his comrades frantically waved the Chinook away. But as it flew off, another mine exploded, badly injuring the unit's commander, Corporal Mark Wright. As Paul crawled towards him, he too was injured.
The blast hit me in the chest. I remember being lifted off the floor and sitting on my bum. Couldn't hear anything, just white dust everywhere, and at that point I thought I was dead. And then all of a sudden I remember getting a pain in my chest. As that pain kicked in, I knew I was alive, and I started to hear things screaming again, you know, mines going off. It was just horrendous.
3.5 hours after the initial explosion, 2 American Black Hawk helicopters with winches lifted the men from the minefield. 3 men had lost legs. Corporal Mark Wright, who had remained conscious and in command throughout, despite appalling injuries, died on the helicopter. He was later awarded the George Cross.
Had we have got that helicopter when we asked for it, I'm absolutely convinced that the number of casualties and the injuries sustained would have been considerably less.
If Black Hawks had came in when we had the first casualty, Mark Wright would still be alive, Stu Pearson would have a leg, Andy Barlow would have a leg, I'd still have my left lung, and Alex Craig would be fighting fit. You know, All these people were injured for no apparent reason, apart from we don't have helicopters to rescue guys.
Over the last few years, I've spent a total of 9 months on the front line in Afghanistan, where the issue of the shortage of helicopters came up every day. There were never enough of the right kind, in the right place, at the right time.
We never had enough helicopters in 2006, and we were making that message very clear in 2005. I think the sad thing is we still don't have enough helicopters.
The question is, why not? This film sets out to shatter the myth that our armed forces are under-resourced. They are not.
We spend £42 billion a year on defence. That's on a par with France and more than any country in the world apart from America and China. So there is no reason why British troops need not be properly equipped on the front line. The problem lies in how the Ministry of Defence spends the money.
Far too much goes on areas that contribute very little to the fighting troops. Patrick Mercer is a former colonel and was Shadow Minister for Homeland Security.
I was invited to dinner by a Major General who was living in a married quarter for which I know he was paying a fraction of its market rental cost. Very nice house indeed. And the place was literally running with domestic staff. Not only did he have an officially designated house sergeant, so, 3 tapes on his arms, who was responsible for running the household, but he'd also alienated 2 other sergeants from his own battalion to come and help run the house. So, whilst that battalion was away at war, this particular individual had taken 2 sergeants to help him run his house rather than going to war. That can't be right. That can't be right.
Britain has one of the most top-heavy militaries in the world. At brigadier level and above, it contains no less than 496 officers. By comparison, the US Marine Corps, which is slightly larger, has just 86.
Over the last few years, the fighting manpower, or the competent manpower of the army, has shrunk and shrunk. Disproportionately large, however, remains the fact that we still have a huge number of generals, brigadiers and the like. How can we possibly have so many chiefs and so few Indians? That can't make sense.
The MOD's failure to downsize the top brass at the same rate as the rest of the military is expensive. These top 500 officers cost around £50 million a year in salaries. Getting them around the country is also a major expense. Kevin Jones was Labour's Deputy Defence Minister and was shocked by the department's extravagance.
Well, for example, they used to have a contract in the Ministry of Defence, £2.4 million a year to, I think it was called, describing in the department as providing pop-star helicopters for the chiefs. I went to Armed Forces Day, I remember last year, to Chatham. I drove down there and the Chief of Defence flew from London to Chatham. And I think if you look at other examples of people using, for example, private jets to fly around the UK, there's a cost of this to the taxpayer which you just cannot justify.
Jones axed the £2.4 million private helicopter budget, to the anger of the Chief of the Defence Staff.
I think there's a lot of resistance, including, I think, on one occasion where the Chief of Defence Staff actually went in and see the Defence Secretary about the decision.
That's Sir Jock Stirrup.
Yes.
Whilst we are aware that we don't have enough helicopters in Helmand, is complaining to the Minister of Defence that he wants to be flown around Britain in a helicopter.
Yeah, but this was the point I always made when I was on the Defence Committee and got pilloried by a lot of newspapers for saying that why was I actually raising these things?
The government will also have to tackle issues that are closer to home for senior officers. The MOD provides the top brass with 413 subsidised residences at a cost to the taxpayer of £36 million a year. The officers do have to pay a contribution to rent, but the top 32 of these alone cost almost £5 million a year, of which 3.4 million goes on servants. Another 173 million goes on school fees for all ranks, which are supposed to offset the disruption of moving home every 2 years. And the MOD also manages to run the most expensive car pool in Westminster.
There was one example I think senior civil servant I learnt about who was travelling every day from London to Abbey Wood, where the Defence Procurement Agency is, and being driven back home every single day.
London to Bristol every day?
Yeah.
And Abbey Wood is next to a railway station?
It's next to a railway station. Bristol Parkway.
The MOD's own statistics reveal that the top 10 civil servants in the department ran up combined car costs last year of over £300,000. We raised these issues with General Sir Richard Dannett, who was head of the army until last year.
Is there not a case for trimming some of the grace and favour home, some of the perks that go with senior rank?
I don't believe in perks as such. Currently, a relatively small number of senior officers live in large houses because they have responsibilities placed on them to entertain local dignitaries, to entertain visiting military people. Nobody is given a staff car as a perk. No one is given a big house as a perk. It is based on necessity. If we want to become just like any other organisation, and very modest and very downhill, fine. Let's do that as a matter of decision. But let's just chip away at these things because they're misthought to be perks. They're not. They have function, and therefore they justify on the basis of function.
Are you aware that there are 32 properties costing the British taxpayer almost £5 million, of which 3.4 million goes on staff?
I wasn't aware of the detail, but I'm aware of the general situation. I think that has to be balanced against the requirement for status of senior officers in some particular occasions, but I do think it should be reviewed because we have to ask the fundamental question that if we can't give frontline troops all they need, perhaps we need to tighten the belt elsewhere.
Whatever the fringe benefits for the top brass should or shouldn't be, the real issue is that there are far too many senior officers, and what is needed is a ruthless cull, the sort of cull that all previous governments have shied away from.
But the money spent on the top brass is tiny compared to what is wasted elsewhere in the Ministry of Defence. The serious money has been squandered on spectacular weapons systems, which are often delivered late and staggeringly over budget.
It's a form of irrational economic insanity, but the price is paid by our armed forces. That's what makes this so outrageous.
The top-heavy nature of the British military, the salaries and benefits enjoyed by senior officers, may be a drain on the public purse. But far more important for next month's defence review will be the £17 billion a year spent on equipment. The challenge facing the MOD is a simple one: to get value for money and to provide the men and women on the front line with the equipment they need. But it's a challenge the department all too often fails. On the 2nd of September 2006, an RAF Nimrod reconnaissance plane crashed over Kandahar in Afghanistan. All 14 men on board were killed. The cause was not enemy action, but mechanical failure. Mike Bell's brother, Flight Sergeant Gerard Bell, was killed in the crash.
There was a phone call, and it was my sister, Anne, and she said, a Nimrod's crashed. And I said, well, what's that got to do with us? And she said, Gerard was on board. And that was a thunderbolt. I could not believe it.
Mike is a former Nimrod flight engineer himself and used his inside knowledge to investigate the crash. He's scathing about the performance of the plane's manufacturer, BAE Systems, which had carried out a safety review of the Nimrod just 2 years before.
It was lamentable, unbelievably and grossly stupid. They had predicated everything on the fact that everywhere on the Nimrod had firewire for detection and they had fire extinguishers for protection.
And that was not true?
And that was totally untrue.
The Nimrod crashed after a fuel leak caused a fire. An official report described the safety review as a lamentable job, a story of incompetence, complacency, and cynicism. But the real scandal of the Nimrod crash is that the plane should not have been in the air at all. The aircraft the RAF should have been using in 2006 was this, the replacement Nimrod MRA-4. And the reason it wasn't encapsulates the waste and frequent incompetence of MOD procurement procedures. Simon Ruddock West worked on the Nimrod replacement for over 10 years.
It was quite apparent early on that things weren't going to schedule. Stories started coming out about initial problems in the design. And I mean, it is widely reported, this phrase, the wings don't fit. Whether that's actually true or not, I can't say, but certainly there have been problems.
Having put in a very low bid to secure the Nimrod contract, BAE decided it would be more cost-effective to reuse the fuselages of the original Nimrods built by hand in the 1960s. Reports at the time claimed that when BAE tried to fit the old bodies with new wings, they discovered that each of the original planes was a different size.
I think by the time the realisation came that so few of the original parts of the aircraft could be used, the design was cast in concrete, and it was very difficult to back out.
BAE claims it fully anticipated variations in the size of the original aircraft. But the fact is, the Nimrod replacement is now 10 years late, and the cost per aircraft has nearly quadrupled to almost £500 million each. The cost to the families of those who died in the Nimrod crash of September 2006 is far greater.
The MRA-4 should have been in service by the year 2000. The accident happened in 2006 with the MRA-4 still not in sight. And here we are in 2010 and it's only just arriving.
Tragically, the hapless story of the new Nimrod is by no means unusual. A recent study of major MOD procurement projects showed that, on average, they run 40% over budget and take 80% longer than agreed to deliver. The Royal Navy's new nuclear submarines are £2.7 billion over budget and more than 8 years late. Its 2 new aircraft carriers are £2.7 billion over budget and almost 4 years late. And its 6 new Type 45 destroyers are each £400 million over budget and more than 7 years late. Ian Godden is a spokesman for British defence manufacturers.
Whose fault are these enormous cost and time overruns?
First of all, 75% of all projects are on time and to budget. There are ways of improving, and the industry has recognised that, and I think any good government will be seeking productivity improvements and changes to the way in which we do things. There's one thing which makes this industry rather difficult, however, that you can never be sure 15 years out what sort of equipment you really, really need. The conflicts change, combat changes, there's huge uncertainty, and sometimes the products that you thought you needed change over time.
But the figures are breathtaking. Dwarfing all others is a single RAF procurement.
This is the Eurofighter. It's a joint project between us, the Germans, the Italians and the Spanish. It's already cost the British taxpayer 20 billion quid, and that's 13 billion pounds over budget. And it's 4.5 years late. Is it any good?
It's fantastic. Of course, you'd expect me to say that, but it really is fantastic. From a pure pilot perspective, you want thrust and you want a big wing. Those two things in combination give you that winning edge, and this has got lots of thrust and a very, very big wing, and that makes it a real joy to fly.
Originally commissioned way back in 1984, the Eurofighter is certainly impressive. But leaving aside the vexed question of whether we need a weapon like this at a time when our principal enemies move around on donkeys, how could the project possibly have spiralled £13 billion out of control? Michael Portillo is one of a number of defence ministers who share responsibility.
I tried to stop it. I thought we might acquire some American aircraft, some F-16s, and get through with that, because it was already clear that we were going to buy very few of these aircraft and the development costs were going to be absolutely enormous. I held out for about 3 months in this position, and fair to say I was eventually overwhelmed. I suppose you could say I was overwhelmed by the industrial political complex.
Despite soaring costs, the Eurofighter has survived various governments, and its durability may, in part, be explained by the name of its British manufacturer.
All of the Ministry of Defence projects that have gone over budget by more than £1 billion have one thing in common. Like the Nimrod, they are all run by BAE Systems.
BAE, originally British Aerospace, declined to be interviewed for this programme. It's Britain's largest defence manufacturer by some distance, and it's been a beneficiary of a historic policy of favouring British companies in the granting of defence contracts, a policy which critics say encourages inefficiency across the British defence industry. Douglas Carswell is a Conservative MP and, until recently, a member of the Public Accounts Committee.
It's basically a protectionist racket. It is pretty much one of the last nationalised industries' vested interests. I don't really see how those like me on the centre-right who believe in choice and competition can really square that belief in choice and competition to raise standards with what's going on with defence procurement. It's a form of irrational economic insanity, but the price we're paying is not simply that there's an industry that is not made as efficient as it should be. The price is paid by our armed forces. That's what makes this so outrageous.
Even when contracts are handled well, British companies rarely enjoy the economies of scale of their American competitors, and they're frequently being asked to design from scratch equipment which could be bought, ready-made, abroad. The policy of favouring British companies is justified by the need to maintain a sovereign, independent defence industry, and its defenders are riled by the suggestion that this amounts to protectionism. Jonathan Band was head of the Navy until last year.
Effectively, we are giving state protection to the arms industry, and we don't do that with coal or steel.
I don't accept that point, and I won't go down that line of questioning.
Why not? I mean, it's a perfectly reasonable question.
Because, the fact of life is that if we as a country wish to play in the world, there are a number of areas where I believe the UK government needs to keep its own handle on certain parts of the technology or certain part of the codes and things. If you want to be quite clear what you're getting, how it's going to work, how you adapt it in service, bearing in mind a lot of these systems are, software-driven systems, you need that sovereignty capability in this country. I'm absolutely convinced of that.
Others disagree. Lewis Page is a former naval officer and now a defence analyst.
Surely it is important for Britain to have a sovereign defence industry so that we're not vulnerable to being cut off. We are, after all, an island nation.
Well, that's a lovely idea, but in point of fact, we don't have such an industry now, so trying to preserve it is a pretty silly idea. You cannot make a modern defence product that isn't full of American stuff. Look at the Eurofighter. You can't sell a Eurofighter to another country, say the Saudis or the Indonesians or someone, without American permission. For why? Because it is full of controlled US military technology, even though it's the Eurofighter. So, sovereign defence industry, don't make me laugh. No such thing.
Frequently, the government falls back on the argument of job protection.
When I hear politicians talking about the fact that if we ended some of these contracts, there would be job losses. I want to turn around and ask those people, do they really think that the primary purpose of our defence budget is the job creation scheme? Because if it is, I think they should go out to Afghanistan and explain that to our soldiers.
It's an argument that's gaining ground, even among some within the defence establishment.
I think what we really can't afford to do is artificially prop up projects, dare I say it without being too hard about it, just to preserve jobs. Defence issues are expensive enough in their own right without the defence budget having to prop up shipyards or aircraft factories just to keep those industries in place. We really ought to buy on a value for money basis where we can get what we most need at the competitive price.
That means buying off the peg, largely.
Where we can buy off the peg, I think we should buy off the peg.
Buying off the peg means shopping around to get the best and cheapest equipment, regardless of who the supplier is. Which is precisely what the SAS often does at this Hereford corner shop.
In early 2008, the quartermasters from 2-3 and 2-1 SAS reserves came into this shop and asked if they could buy 150 of these. And they bought them off the peg. They didn't want to use the ones that are issued to the regular army because they've got some serious design flaws. Now, what was on offer to them for the regular troops was this. It had a shiny toggle that could be picked up by infrared sensors, and bizarrely, the special heat dispersing material that formed the lining was put on inside out or back to front, so that instead of facing towards the body of the troops who were carrying this in 46 degrees centigrade, it actually faced the sun. So they were able to buy these off the peg because they're the special forces, and the special forces are allowed to do that kind of thing. They got something that was better and cheaper.
The design flaws in the standard issue body armour have since been addressed, but the principle of buying off the peg is one that can be applied far beyond a Hereford corner shop. This is the Paris Arms Fair. Companies from all around the world come here to tout their latest equipment.
Arms fairs like this are a one-stop shop for off-the-peg military equipment. It's often a fraction of the price charged to the British taxpayer, and it's almost exactly the same stuff.
I stopped for a chat at the Colt stand.
Well, here's something I recognise from Helmand Province. Some British troops use this, don't they?
Some do, yes.
Do you know who?
Yes, but we're not at liberty to say.
All right, I'll say it. It's the SAS.
Indeed.
OK, so this is a gun that's good enough for the SAS, so it'd be good enough for most soldiers. Was Colt ever in the running for selling its weapons to the Brits?
We could have, but we were never asked. We would have loved to. And we think we could have supplied the whole British Army with this quality weapon instead of what they have now.
At a cheaper price?
At a lower price.
The Pentagon buys M16s at £350 a time, around half what the MOD paid for its British SA-80 rifles. Shopping around clearly works for the SAS, and what makes sense for them surely makes sense for the rest of the British military.
When push comes to shove, for example in Afghanistan, the stuff that works, that's really needed, is generally bought off the peg and from the Americans.
I just disagree with that.
But all of our armoured protective vehicles, apart from the Jackal, are American built.
I just disagree with your basic thesis. We export more from this country than any other nation apart from the US. We are the #1 exporter from Europe. We're the #2 in the world. Your thesis just doesn't hold up on that basis. These nations would not be buying rubbish. They wouldn't.
In fact, these figures are disputed. Others say Britain is the 4th largest arms exporter in the world. And critics believe that the inefficiencies in the MOD procurement process derive in part from a relationship with contractors which is far too cosy. Official government statistics show that, over the last 5 years, almost 1,000 MOD personnel have left the department to take jobs with defence contractors. This dwarfs the number leaving any other department for jobs with their contractors and accounts for more than a third of all such movements out of the civil service. Lord McLennan served on the body which scrutinises such movements.
There is too much of this going on. The problem is not one of corruption, it's one of the possibility of minds being moved before they leave the public service about issues which ought to be viewed in a totally objective fashion. It can't be acceptable from a public point of view to have cosy relationships between departments and suppliers.
Jonathan Band holds 2 jobs with defence contractors.
Senior officers such as yourself go from the military environment into a company rather rapidly. Do you think that's an area that we could look at for reform?
No, I mean, I think you have to look at the appropriateness, which we do. I mean, I'm really being employed as much as to give companies advice about the general defence customer, the scene. I'm not an expert in buying kit. I've never had a job in 40 years in the Navy of buying equipment. They haven't bought me for procurement. They haven't bought me because I'm going to do some deal under the table. They bought me to understand the UK defence scene better.
But what about in the last sort of dying days of one's uniform career or a top civil servant's career? Isn't there almost subconscious desire to schmooze?
No.
No?
No, not in my case, not at all. It's not the J Band style. I'm not a schmoozer.
It's not just military personnel and civil servants who pass through the revolving door. 4 of the last 10 defence secretaries have also taken jobs with defence contractors. Among them, Michael Portillo.
In your own case, you went from Secretary of State to a non-executive directorship at BAE. Did you not think that was inappropriate?
No, I didn't actually. There was a gap of 5 years. I mean, in the case of BAE, the one thing they don't have to do is to buy political influence, because the chairman and the chief executive of BAE can go into 10 Downing Street whenever they wish and see the Prime Minister, and that has always applied. And so I was never asked to do anything political or lobbying because, I was inconsequential compared with the clout that the chairman and the chief executive had.
The new government will need to sever the umbilical cord connecting the MOD to its principal contractors if it is to effectively tackle the inefficiencies in procurement. But it's clear the industry does have its champions in the department. This is Gerald Howarth, the new Minister for International Security Strategy at the MOD, and a man who makes no secret of his support for the defence industry.
We should pay tribute to all Britain's defence industry, whether large or small, for the incredible job that they do. And far from decrying them, I would like to pay the warmest possible tribute.
Howarth's enthusiasm is possibly explained by the fact that BAE has its headquarters in his constituency. He was the Conservatives' Shadow Procurement Minister for 8 years, and even once registered a lobbyist whose clients included BAE as part of his parliamentary staff. In a statement to Dispatches, Gerald Howarth said he had no commercial involvement in BAE Systems and had always sought to be professional and objective in his approach to defence matters. But the defence industry is certainly happy to see him in the department.
Those who are enthusiastic, interested and committed to an industry are more likely to sell defence exports worldwide. And what we've seen is not just with Gerald Howarth, but with Liam Fox and with the whole new cabinet in this administration, a commitment to defence exports which we find positive.
It's true Howarth's principal focus will be exports, but as a minister, he will also have input on the defence review, and his presence in the department will hardly reassure critics of the sovereign defence policy. The close relationship between the MOD and its contractors cannot be blamed for all the waste in procurement. While some contractors have failed to deliver, the department itself is every bit as much to blame for the massive cost overruns.
It pays everybody to underestimate the risks, underestimate the costs, and hope that at best they can muddle through, and at worst the programme will blow up, but they'll be able to get more money for it and deliver it in the future.
I believe the policy of favouring British manufacturers in the granting of defence contracts has provided poor value for money and contributed to the massive black hole in the MOD's budget. But it would be unfair to place all the blame for the problems in procurement at the door of the contractors. The MOD itself supplies its own quota of incompetence and inefficiency. This is the MOD's main procurement centre at Abbey Wood in Bristol. Almost 10,000 people are employed here, and that's just half the total number working in procurement. Many lack sufficient training, particularly among the military personnel.
The training for uniformed people is not really what it could be. For example, it's not unknown at all for, say, a Jaguar operator to spend most of his life flying, become a squadron commander, become a station commander, and then broadly get parachuted into a one-star post where he's heading up the procurement of Eurofighter. A lot of people, like myself, chose to go down the procurement route, but yet there was no structured training for us at all. And whilst training is paramount for one as an aircrew, that doesn't seem to get carried across into procurement.
The very fact that we have 20,000 paid officials to assess how the MOD conducts its procurement, to me tells me that something is badly wrong.
The MOD's accounting procedures are a particular focus of criticism.
The Queen Elizabeth-class aircraft carrier will be the biggest and most powerful surface warship ever constructed for the UK.
This lavishly produced simulation was made by the manufacturers of the new aircraft carriers, one of several projects which, incredibly, the MOD itself has decided to slow down. It does this in order to make short-term savings, despite the fact that in the long term, this actually increases the overall cost. It's Tim Banfield's job to monitor the MOD's accounts.
What happens with the defence budgeting process is that there is usually too much money being asked for in early years, so in the next couple of years. So what they have to do is find a way of reducing that overspend. And typically the MOD does that by delaying projects, so pushing them out a bit further. And I'll give you an example of that with the aircraft carriers, where to save about £400 million over the next 4 years, the MOD's actually increased costs by £1 billion in the 6 years after that. So all of a sudden we've got between £600 and £700 million of extra costs coming in to get some short-term affordability. Decisions like the carriers were poor value for money.
I said at the time, and I say now, the decision to extend the carrier programme was, in my view, short-sighted. But, you know, I was just the head of the Navy, and there were bigger things at play.
The result of this endless deferring of costs is what the defence industry calls a bow wave, where, as costs are pushed back, they expand. And this has contributed to a cost overrun at the MOD, which could be as high as £38 billion over the next 10 years.
All you're doing is delaying the problems. When it comes to what I might call the slash and burn of in-year savings, the amount of analysis that goes into the repercussions would make the jottings on the back of a fag packet look detailed. And I don't think that's healthy.
Casual accounting and a cosy relationship with contractors come together to create the most intractable of all the problems the MOD will have to confront. A phenomenon known as the conspiracy of optimism. It's a phenomenon bound up with the traditional curse of the armed forces, inter-service rivalry. Sash Tusa is one of Britain's leading defence analysts.
Each of the individual services is fighting for budget, but they also know that if they are honest about the true costs and the true risks, then the programme may never go ahead. It pays everybody to underestimate the risks, underestimate the costs, and hope that at best they can muddle through, and at worst the programme will blow up, but they'll be able to get more money for it and deliver it in the future.
Is there a sense that the three services compete against each other, and that this feeds into what you call the conspiracy of optimism?
There is a tension in there, and part of that plays through with each of the armed services wanting to champion its own equipment. In theory, there is a process that enables judgments to be made. In practice, what happens is the Ministry of Defence isn't good enough at prioritising. And once you start to say, yes, I want to buy something, it very seldom changes its mind and says, no, I can't afford it, I won't.
Everybody wants it to work, and that persists until something significant happens where you get a massive cost overrun. It's like building up water behind a dam. Eventually the dam breaks. I think there's always a worry that if you expose everything, that the programme will get cancelled. And nobody wants to see that, except maybe the taxpayer.
What we're dealing with here is Britain's own rather modest version of a military-industrial complex. One that comprises senior officers, arms manufacturers, and civil servants. Add to this the problem of inter-service rivalry, and the result is a series of structures and processes that seem incapable of efficiently producing the equipment that our men and women on the front line need. Which brings us back to helicopters.
Resupply was one of the big things. I think for 3-4 weeks we didn't have a resupply. We were down to half a box of 50 cal rounds. We were splitting magazines down for ammunition. Food and water were quite scarce, and medical equipment. I lost about 2 stone on that tour.
Resupply means helicopters.
Definitely so, yeah. Definitely so. Helicopters are the key to everything. You know, realistically, movement, resupply, you know, fighting the firefight. Everything's bound around helicopters.
So why, in 2006, just as the campaign in Helmand was getting underway, did the MOD spend almost £2 billion commissioning this? The Future Links from British company Augusta Westland. I managed to get a peek at the Royal Navy variant while at Farnborough and was immediately struck by the blindingly obvious. It's very small.
The trouble with the Lynx is it has limited lift capability. If you asked any commander worth his salt on the ground what sort of helicopter he wants, he'll tell you he wants a Chinook for heavy lift, he wants an Apache helicopter to give him fire support as a gunship, and he wants Black Hawk helicopter to do all those other things like casualty evacuation, winching peoples out of minefields. And they will say Black Hawk again and again.
The larger Black Hawks could have been bought off the peg from the Americans. So why weren't they? I wanted to ask Sir Kevin Tebbit, the top civil servant at the MOD when the Future Links deal was being negotiated. He's now chair of Finmeccanica UK, parent company to the Lynx's manufacturer. But he didn't want to talk to me ahead of the defence review. Instead, I asked the man who was head of the army back in 2006.
Every single soldier I've spoken to in the field and who's been in the field, particularly in Afghanistan and Iraq over the last 10 years, comes up with one-word answers to the helicopter issue, and that word is Black Hawk. I mean, who took the decision to go for a helicopter that doesn't do what everybody wants it to do?
I don't accept that premise. And the Army Air Corps fraternity that will operate Wildcat, Future Links, is entirely comfortable that Future Links is the aircraft we're going to have. That's not to say Black Hawk is not a very good helicopter, but I've been around the Black Hawk thing while I was Chief of the General Staff several times and had to accept the argument that it was not affordable.
But probe more closely, and it's clear that the Black Hawk was also a victim of obscure inter-service rivalries. Helicopters have historically been underfunded because they fall between the 3 different services and are a priority for none of them. The convention is that large helicopters are part of the RAF, while smaller ones belong to the Army Air Corps. Black Hawks fall right on the dividing line between the two and were therefore a source of tension.
I would be quite happy to have Black Hawk as opposed to Future Links, provided it is seen as what it is, which is a system that supports soldiers on the ground and therefore should be flown by soldiers. I discussed it with Air Chief Marshal Glenn Torpey while he was head of the Air Force and said, don't even dream of going down that track if the decision is for Black Hawk. These are aircraft that are part of the Army All-Bat and will be flown by soldiers. Let's be quite clear about that.
And how does the RAF react when you take quite such a firm line on toys that they might think should be in their box?
Well, I wouldn't presume to fly fast jets by soldiers. Let's all do what we're good at. Let's get into silly games.
In the end, it seems silly games was precisely what killed the Black Hawk. The RAF and Army were at loggerheads about who should fly it. The Army Air Corps was nevertheless determined not to be squeezed out of operating helicopters. The Future Lynx was its only alternative. The result? The MOD is now spending more than £1.5 billion on a helicopter which is too small to act as an effective troop carrier in Afghanistan. Only root and branch reform of the MOD's structures and procurement processes can end such insanity, but it will be a mammoth task.
It's going to be astonishingly hard. Until the defence procurement budget comes back into balance, and to do that will require massive cuts, complete programmes taken out, and sacred cows slaughtered. Until that happens, you can't break the conspiracy of optimism.
I think we've been very good at analysing the problem. Hitherto, no one has yet come up with the perfect or the much better system of actually managing these things. Now the money is absolutely tight. There is an absolute imperative to get it right.
It is going to take a lot of strength, and it's a strength around decision-making and governance that hasn't always been apparent.
Defence Secretary Liam Fox declined to talk to this programme ahead of the Defence Review. But in a statement he said,
"The government accepts that it must become more effective, more efficient and more fiscally responsible to ensure our forces on the front line have the support they need. The government has committed to defence reviews every 5 years to ensure the defence programme does not return to its current unaffordable state."
And the MOD continues to deny that there is a shortage of helicopters in Afghanistan. As the Defence Review looms, it would be unforgivable to cut without reforming. It would be a betrayal of men like these, the 3rd Rifles, who returned from Afghanistan in April, having lost 1 in 10 either killed or injured during a 6-month tour. A rate of attrition which is on a par with the First World War.
I'm really proud of them, every credit to them, working in those difficult situations. I really don't know how they do it.
The very least these troops should expect is a Ministry of Defence back in London that is fit for purpose.
If bold action is taken, then the heavy cuts expected to hit defence need not be devastating, and these soldiers can get the equipment and support they still need to fight the wars demanded of them.
One thing is certain, chronic waste and inefficiency is no longer an option.
You can post your comments about this programme on our website at channel4.com/dispatches. Mum, Dad and kids clamber into their 4x4 for a crazy gap year crossing Africa. Daring stuff next.